All right, welcome everybody to our fifth lecture of the what is the Anthropocene Lecture Series. Today we talk about health checks from a health check and a justice check in the Anthropocene. We have two speakers for that, Petra Verdonk and David Rossati. Petra will actually start. If I receive your presentation, time is still on the way, but we'll figure that out. Yeah, Petra works, well, at the VU, but at the hospital, so just next door. And she is a psychologist with a special focus on the ethics and in the health sector. So she is part of the Department of Ethics, Law and Humanities at now it's called Amsterdam UMC. And she wrote her thesis on gender matters in medical education. So that gives you a bit of an idea what she does. She also founded the Dutch Association for Gender and Health, and I'm sure she can talk a bit more about that later. But before, we have Sjoerd to give an introduction to the topic of today, and I will introduce David later on once we get there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neele. So welcome everyone to the almost fifth lecture on the Anthropocene. So you can see all the subjects we covered so far. It's quite a list, and we're also happy to announce now that we're able to publish a special issue on this series. So we're collecting papers, and we found a nice platform also to publish that. So if all things went well, in a couple of, say, 6 months to 12 months, you're able to read it all as well. So it will be preserved in that sense. But first, we have to delve into the health and the justice of the Anthropocene. And so I have a small introduction for you. To talk about these issues. And I'm using actually a familiar under Scientist Rebellions at the VU, a presentation, some slides on climate facts. And that is also to make a case for injustice, climate injustice or justice, and an introduction to the checks that David and Petra will give us on the Anthropocene. So, of course, we've seen this before. This is the famous, or the infamous, however you want to call it, planetary boundaries slide. Bjorn Röckström was republished again this year by Richardson et al. In Science, indicating that we as humanity have already transgressed 6 out of 9 interlinked planetary boundaries, and just seriously addressing also the seriousness issues in the Anthropocene. We of course look at this is one way, like how the sciences are looking at from planetary boundaries, the biophysical boundaries there are. Then, of course, there's the Kate Raworth donut concept of just having the same sort of boundaries, the safe and just green space for humanity below the ecological ceiling, but also above the social foundation. That's exactly where David and Petra will be talking about equality issues, about injustice issues, also about health issues. And by looking at health, I already circled water and food, because what are we? What is our health without water and food, or the quality of water and food? So it's all interrelated, it is interrelated. So, so what is the relationship between health ethics and the law of the Anthropocene? What effects do they have? Neele, something happening? Oh, there. Yeah. What effects do human rights have on healthy and a safe environment? Also, the knowledge about law, research integrity, which we hope to find an ethical reflection, are essential for studying human health in the Anthropocene. And we'll discuss the inequalities and equalities regards to these subjects. But first, let's do the case for climate injustice. So it may be very clearly assessed that warming is caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It can even be quantified how much of a contribution this human influence has to the warming. It's an order of magnitudes different from the influence of solar and volcanic drivers and internal variability. So we humans have a much greater impact than natural drivers of climate change, if that was not clear. So the first fact that we're emitting a lot of CO2 by burning fossil fuels. That's the first fact. CO2 emissions from human activities are now higher than any point in history. The last time we had this level of CO2, this high level, we had plants on Antarctica, and sea level was 20 meters higher than now. And that gives an idea about how extremely different this level is. Based on ice cores and other paleoclimatic evidence, we know that during ice age cycles of the past million years, atmospheric carbon dioxide never exceeded 300 parts per million. And before the Industrial Revolution, started in the mid-70s, atmospheric carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million or less. So science has a firm handle on the various reasons why the climate changes naturally. Okay, so the first most important fact about carbon dioxide is that CO2 emissions were cumulative. Emitted CO2 stays in the atmosphere like a thickening blanket. Moreover, there's a linear relationship between cumulative CO2 and warming. That means that burning fossil fuels equals burning the planet. It means that less emissions do not mean less warming, but a slower increase in temperature. Only no emissions can slowly contribute to a cooling planet. So with rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse emissions, we could clearly see the effect on global temperature in 20 years. So indeed, we can calculate how much CO2 we can still emit, and before 1.5 degrees. That calculation is worrying. Slip back. Yeah. Okay. So, which means that by now 90% of our budget is gone. We want to reach the Paris goals. We have to reduce our emissions by 10% every year. Okay, but I want to go to the historical one. Yeah, the historical responsibility for climate change. That CO2 emissions have increased the average temperature since the Industrial Revolution, but are not emitted equally by just anyone. There's a huge carbon inequality. Almost half of the emissions are emitted by the richest 10%. And carbon emissions of the richest 1% more than double the emissions of the poorest half of humanity. So that's one of the the greatest inequalities we have in the world as it comes to carbon emissions. Okay, I'm almost at the end, I think. It's disturbing my slideshow. Next slide, please, Neele. Yeah. Okay, so we are clearly not on track from 1.5. And the second problematic thing about the carbon budget, besides the fact that we found that fossil fuels are the major contribution, is that we found more coal, gas, and oil than we can extract if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Research shows that the consequence of a carbon budget in line with 1.5 degrees means that 60% of oil and gas reserves and 90% of coal reserves must remain unextracted. The pathway to net zero means no oil and gas fields approvals 2 years ago. So clearly we're not on a track at the moment. Getting to my last slide. So to summarize, the next few years are critical. The 1.5 degree is not a goal or target, but it's a dangerous limit. The only real goal is 0 degrees if we want to avoid more extreme disasters. It's our generation, our class, and our region's responsibility to stop the dangerous addictions to fossil fuels as soon as possible. The latest IPCC report states very clearly, only drastic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions can mitigate the ongoing ecocide and climate crisis. Okay, so let's do everything we can to achieve that. And let's explore in this lecture the series The Health and Justice Checks of Petra Verdonk and David Rossati.
Oh, right. No, it doesn't have sound. It just spews trouble. So thank you for being here and thank you for inviting me. My name is Petra Verdonk. I work as an associate professor at the Department of Ethics, Law and Humanities in Amsterdam UMC. I am affiliated with VU University. And I chair the section on participation and diversity, and I do research on gender and diversity issues in health and healthcare. And I, let's say, ran into the climate crisis personally a couple of years ago, and that's where it hit me so hard that I call it an ecological epiphany, and that's a very biblical word. And I do not have a religious background, but I still call it an epiphany. It was very heavy and hard, and it took me months to get back to sleep at night again. And I have been a climate activist ever since, and also started reading, because I'm one of those people who, I'm 58, and I'm just one of those people who filled their tank with green diesel, and I ate organic, and I thought we were all doing fine. And I'm sorry, I apologize for that, especially to the younger generation. But this is how it is, and so I'm trying to do what I can, and also trying to incorporate this issue in my work in all sorts of ways. And I see some of my fellow rebels here trying to get to university, let's say, to move over a little bit and make some changes that are necessary. Anyways, in this lecture or this short talk, I would like to, I'll start with breaking bad news. That's, I think, for healthcare and for medicine, breaking bad news, that's something that they're familiar with, that they are capable of doing. And the analogy with the planet being very ill, having fever, needing care, that's very useful metaphor for physicians and health professionals. The problem with a lot of the work that's being done in healthcare is that they overlook the idea of injustice and climate justice, etc. So they tend to focus, like medicine does, to focus on what I always call hay fever, increase in hay fever, and the prolonged pollen season. That's very bad for patients. It really is. There are a lot of accounts of very bad hay fever. But the notion of injustice and inequality is very often overlooked. So I try to squeeze that in where I can, and try to do that here as well. So as Sjoerd already said, the IPCC said the sixth assessment report in 2021 was clear. It says the planet is warming, humans are the cause, and no place is safe. Well, the question is whether that is true. There are places where it's safer than other places, and there are people in places who are safer than other people. So the notion that we're all in the same boat and that we're all having the same problems with this, I think we should correct that idea, as there are quite a few issues with it. In the Western media, the news, when it comes to health, you very often see these issues in particular, well, things like air pollution and wildfires, the prices going up because of crop failures and the food system collapsing in certain ways, more or less, and vector-borne diseases. That's something that's a big issue. Causing infectious diseases in people, and a lot of those factors are creeping up to northern regions because it gets warmer here. I just wanted to give a few examples of health and how the climate crisis affects health, so you get the drill, because this is endless and non-stop everywhere in all health issues and all organ systems, etc. But just a few. Infectious diseases, a fantastic, incredible review done by Mora and colleagues, published last year. And this is a bit of a merciless slide, but I would like to highlight the four mechanisms that they identified. One being, like, if you look at the relationship between climatic hazards, so extreme weather events, warming, sea level rise, etc. They found over 1,000 different pathways that infectious diseases are changed by global warming and ecological crisis. The first one being climatic hazards bring pathogens closer to people. For instance, by warming, ticks, mosquitoes, like all sorts of vectors bringing Lyme disease that we all heard of, malaria creeping up in Europe again, Zika, we heard about that in South America. Well, those sorts of problems, but also habitat disruption, so flooding, wildfires, etc., thawing permafrost, maybe releasing vectors, releasing viruses, etc., that may spill over to the human habitats again. The second mechanism is people getting closer to the pathogens. For instance, when it gets warmer, people start looking for a cooler place. They go to water, to lakes, they try and find some relief. But also, obviously, human displacement, as we're seeing across the globe, people fleeing from their habitats for all sorts of reasons, and also from natural disasters. The third one, the pathogens can be strengthened by climatic hazards, so their virulence can be stronger, like they can be heavier, more causing more severe diseases. That's one reason. And the fourth mechanism is that people can be impaired. People's health can be impaired by climatic hazards, and that happens, for instance, when there are huge temperature differences. And that's one of the things that I've experienced myself, like not being able to adapt to a huge temperature change within so many hours, within a day. So that's a big issue, and infectious diseases and human vulnerability will be very costly and problematic to society. We've already seen, obviously, the pandemic. So that's just one example that we can all relate to how that affects our lives. The second example is cardiovascular health. Heart health is influenced by warming temperatures. So 1 degree or 1 centigrade increase in temperature is already positively associated with cardiovascular disease, with increasing morbidity, mortality, so more disease and more death from heart disease, in particular stroke and coronary heart disease, and arrhythmias, cardiac arrest are also associated with just the average warming. Then there's heat waves, and they intensify in very severe ways. They intensify the mortality and also morbidity from cardiovascular disease. So that's about 12% in particular for stroke and for coronary heart disease, and that increases also with the intensity of the heat wave. So that's a big issue, and the mechanism, how does it work, is because people cannot lose their heat. During a heat wave, it gets harder to lose heat. It gets harder to refill with water, to cool the body down. And also the viscosity of the blood gets, like the blood gets thicker. And so there may be more thromboembolisms, like small clots traveling through the body and then clogging up in places where you can have an embolism. And that increases, obviously, the risk of stroke because there's a barrier somewhere. Then particulate matter, so air pollution, also increases cardiovascular health. Fine dust, the particulate matter 2.5 and also the bigger particles. Well, this also increases the morbidity of cardiovascular disease, artery disease in particular, and it has its effect on inflammation in the arteries, and that's a cumulative issue for people being long-term exposed, but there's not many studies done, like longitudinal studies, so that we know how this actually affects the heart. Well, these are just a few issues. This is a very nice graph from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. And it just, I think you get the drill from this, like extreme weather, warming in general, etc., affects all these organ systems and all these health issues overall. So from the respiratory diseases to cardiovascular to sexual and reproductive health, injuries and fatalities from disasters, etc. It's like, let's say, it's really bad news when it comes to health. So this is another way of putting it. What you see here is the big CO2 cloud, the green cloud at the top of the slide, and that has its effect on ocean acidification, extreme weather, and warming, and also air pollutants. And these all, let's say, leak down into human health, human bodies in all sorts of ways. And in the green column on the right of the slide, you see the loss of habitation, you see poverty, you see mass migration, violent conflict, and other social determinants of health. And we'll get to that later. What's so interesting about a lot of studies or overview or review studies in medicine is that very often they do not address sexual and reproductive health. So I could not resist at least mentioning that, because I think it's a big issue. There are direct effects, for instance, because of air pollution, the effect of air pollution on unborn children. It also increases the time to pregnancy, so it affects fertility. It affects miscarriages, and obviously it affects the health of the unborn child, for instance, lifelong asthma and that sort of health problems, as we now know. I think a couple of years, 2 years ago, we saw on the news that air pollution can actually pass the placenta to the unborn child. Extreme weather events also affect fertility, and that's very often unknown to people. Like extreme heat is associated with lower birth weight in children, increased preterm birth, but also it affects the fertility of women and men. Of men, that was already known for a long time that heat would decrease men's fertility, but it obviously also does something to women's fertility. So there's a huge range of health issues resulting from the climate and ecological crisis in terms of sexual and reproductive health, drinking water, and salinity in the Netherlands. That's a big issue in the western part of the country. Drinking water is getting more salty, and that will be increasing over time way more, resulting in hypertension and preeclampsia, maybe even preeclampsia in pregnant women, but also vector-borne diseases. Zika was a big issue for pregnant women. And also think of disrupted care chains during extreme weather events and natural disasters, when there's no midwife available and there's no devices, no supplies available. Something interesting happened last year in the summer, where we actually received this wonderful new human right. And the new human right that we have is a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and so now we're waiting to get that. Maybe that's being implemented. I live to see it. David's nodding no. Why are you nodding no? Okay, anyways, this is your field, so I'm happy to learn from you. Okay, so let me get to a bigger topic, namely the climate capitalism and care. Because a lot of researchers and philosophers and academics say that this climate crisis is much bigger. It's one aspect of a much broader planetary crisis. Nancy Fraser, a political philosopher, she calls it a crisis of care. And she says, look, the background conditions that are necessary for capitalism are externalized, they are invisibilized, we don't see them, we don't see how much care is necessary to make the world go round, we don't see it, and if we don't see it and we do not replenish, we do not pay attention to it, we draw deficits. And we draw deficits in reproduction, as she calls it, in reproductive parts of society, to the benefit of production. We draw a benefit in reproduction, in replenishing and re-energizing and taking care of our health. And the same thing happens with non-human nature. We take from it as if it's for free and as if it's infinite. And she says this current capitalist system is crisis prone. It itself destabilizes all the time because it does not recognize its own conditions for possibility, such as human health and such as care, not only healthcare in terms of professional healthcare, but the care that we do all day for ourselves and our loved ones and the world that we live in. And this is classed and it's racialized, and she says it's rooted in colonial history. Now, the question is whether that is true. Yes, it's rooted in colonial history, but it's not history the way we move forward now. It's also the future. And this is the future if we would extrapolate the path that we're on right now, so the path towards 2.7 centigrades, 50 years from now, there will be 9.5 billion people as calculated right now, and 2 billion of those people will live in a world that has a mean annual temperature of 29 centigrades. And that so happens to be these people living in these areas. So the question is whether colonialism has gone. I don't think so myself. This is the small country that I was born in and live in, with a very, very big footprint, carbon footprint, and responsibility for what's happening in this picture. So some authors call this climate coloniality. I really find that, for me, that's an insightful concept. We're actually still colonizing the world, colonizing the atmosphere based on historical power structures. And this is perpetuated through land grabs, through water steals, through, well, we need the Southern materialism, we need the minerals and the whatever for our own energy transition here and for our lifestyles and our cell phones, etc. And that's how we in this country can have such a nice green service economy, because in other countries we get the raw materials and we do not replenish, and we do not consider how we draw a deficit there. So this is one example, the boundary struggle between human and non-human nature, and this is how we cross the planetary boundaries, or the Earth system boundaries that Sjoerd talked about. So if you look at climate justice and critical climate justice, very often they are identified in three bigger concepts. One would be the interspecies, so justice between humans and non-human life. intergenerational, so that's us living now and maybe the generations to come, maybe that are not even born yet, or if they will, given the reproductive health issues that we're seeing. And intragenerational, that would be like us and the global south, but also in this country, who lives near waste places, highways, etc., whose health is affected by data or emissions from all sorts of companies. Very often, most often, not the people who are white and rich and wealthy, etc. I'll finish up because I think I'll have to wrap up, no? And I think that David will continue with this issue a bit more, maybe. Yeah, you are, okay. So this is the injustice that refers to how people are affected differently, and we need to obviously readdress these issues in fair ways. And they're very big words, like the polluter pays, like the historical responsibility, like the ability to pay, all sorts of ethical issues that we need to pay attention to if we transition, but also if we do not transition, who gets affected and who doesn't. But also when we do the transition, how do we do it in a fair way? And this is where you see the let's say the bigger determinants of health that are affected. It's in a way the same picture that I showed before. On the left hand, you see the extreme weather events and the global warming. You will see the indirect effects in the more orange column, like water quality, air pollution, etc. And these issues all interact heavily with age, with gender, with people's existing health status or their underlying health conditions, with their socioeconomic positioning in life, the social capital that they have, whether they have access to public health and health systems, and what about mobility, whether they can actually reach healthcare and how mobile they are. So the point I would like to make is that we need an ethics of care for planetary health, not just for ourselves, for human health, but we need to take this bigger picture because planetary health is the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. There is no human life when the life-sustaining systems are targeted and violated and broken down. Yeah, I just love this picture. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have some time for direct questions right now. Otherwise, we also can just continue with the second speaker. But if you have any questions for clarification or anything that comes to your mind right now. Yeah, that's one. Or any comments? Yeah. Exactly.
Well, thank you, Petra. Of course, this very nice overview, or nice. We could debate if it's nice or not. Huh?
Yeah.
When do you think it becomes really critical? Because you know when Zika comes or when all kinds of diseases come and the problem with water and with higher temperature. So, of course, things go gradual. What will be the wake-up call in the health issues?
What I find interesting is when, because it depends on who you ask. Because for a lot of people, the apocalypse has happened already. So their world is destroyed already, their health, and so that depends. I think we're still good to go pretty much here. What you see is that floods and extreme weather don't do very much in terms of wake-up call. I'm not sure. What I found interesting is that droughts in particular seem to have a very big awareness-raising effect in people. And I'm not really sure why, especially droughts, that would be something to look into, but it's maybe something very basic to do with water. That would be my guess as a psychologist, but it's, yeah.
I would say, sorry, just to comment on that and another question, it also takes a long time. Flood comes and goes, a wildfire comes and goes, but a drought can take 10 years.
Yeah.
And sometimes. But my question to you, what was the cause of your ecological epiphany?
One was it's a bit of a longer story. Okay, I get permission here. What happened is that I had the flu in March 2018, and I was about to visit my daughter who lives in Australia. So I went on the plane with like a bit of a flu still. I didn't feel very fit, very well. And it was -4 here. And as I got off the plane in Australia, it was +36. And I didn't manage the 40 degrees. I didn't manage the jet lag. I didn't manage the flu that I had. So I got really sick and I had to call in a doctor. And I know enough about health that this wasn't very severe. I knew that. But it was really shocking because I felt like in a few hours I was just breaking down and I really needed help. And so far so good. Then that same summer I ended up in another heat wave on a mountain in the north of Italy, where I was looking over olive plantation, watching it break down. So that was a next step. Like, it's not just me that's being hurt by the heat, but this is our food and this is life breaking down. There was this very small, that same week, there was this very small newspaper article that I saw on my cell phone about the IPCC, and that was also repeated in October. And I'm one of those people who had never heard of the IPCC, that had, like, I have missed that completely. And so in October, yeah, I'm sorry. And then in October, the news came out again with another IPCC report on page 7, and I saw it, and like it all added up, and I didn't sleep anymore. I was, and it was actually two things. One was, this is going really wrong, and there is no plan. And I think that was, as a Dutch person, all faithful in Dutch democracy, that was, I think, for me, the biggest shock. Like, they don't even have a plan. So I realized that immediately. And then I started looking, it was the same fall where Greta Thunberg had just started her school strikes, and then Extinction Rebellion was blocking London. And I realized immediately, like, we need to do something like that, because the normal routines, I never considered myself stupid. There may be discussion about that. I never thought of myself as being stupid. I'm highly educated, and I realized, okay, so if this doesn't even reach me, I was part of the Shell case. I was one of the plaintiffs in the Shell case, and still somehow it didn't sink in the way it did at that moment. So there I am. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, the message is quite, well, you mentioned the word apocalyptic. So we are it's very worrisome, and you provide data for the effects, the harmful effects for our planet. I was wondering, do you perhaps also see some hopes for the future, that there are perhaps empirical developments or findings that give you more of an optimistic view about the future?
That's a beautiful question. And I'm sorry, it was a 20 minutes. So I decided to bring bad news, but here's the treatment. No. The thing is this, like, when it comes to health, I think climate measures have very beautiful health co-benefits, as they call it. So everything we do, not everything, but a lot of things that we can do to mitigate the climate crisis and to adapt to what's happening are beneficial to health. Public transportation, plant-based diets, air pollution targeted. These are all really good ideas for health. So in terms of, like, scaring people off with the health message, and then giving them the message that if you target this, You know, there are a lot of gains for health. I think that's where we need the healthcare system to make a change. We need doctors on the streets in their white coats, spreading the message that this is a big issue and that there's actually something waiting for us that's maybe a good idea, and not only loss. I was at the Dutch Design Week last week, and there a lot of designers and social designers are working on this, and we just need more imagination. And with that, we need a little help. Don't ask academics that question. That's not what we're good at. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And I think this phone thing.
No, it's not mine.
Yours.
Or
Yes, thank you, Petra. So maybe just a quick comment on that. Don't ask academics. So parallel to these lectures, we also organize workshops on storytelling. So we had the first one already, and we are organizing a second one on 21st of November. And I think people are allowed to join the second one if they haven't followed the first one, if they do the homework. But the idea there is also to approach this topic from a different angle and to, not only for yourself, but to also communicate it in a different way. Because, there's probably a multitude of tools and avenues required to get the message across. Okay, so with that, we turn to our second speaker. So that's David Rossati of the law faculty here at the VU. David is there an assistant professor of public international law, and you focus your research on the implementation of international climate finance commitments and of the carbon market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. So we'll now switch the focus to law and to legal aspects of the Anthropocene. And with that, I welcome you to the floor.
No, just the notes.
Yeah.
So thanks, Neele, for organizing this. Thanks for being here. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Sjoerd, for the invitation. It's going to be very difficult to follow up to your moving presentation, Petra. My ambition here is different. So I would like to share with you some thoughts that were instigated by this invitation, that were kind of a hazard in my mind for a while. I've been dealing with international climate change law for a bit, so I've seen, the climate regime in international law, and now the problem of dealing with the climate has been regulated for some time. And what I would like to share with you is actually some elements for interdisciplinary discussion here. So this is what I'm seeking with regards to actually the specific topic of this lecture series, which is the Anthropocene. And this comes not only from my teaching, my research, but also by some sporadic practice that I've been doing as a legal advisor pro bono for delegates at the UN negotiations from least developed countries that engage with the process. And also for, again, pro bono consultancies, legal advising that I've been giving to NGOs, for instance. So there is also something coming from practice here. And my ambition in 20 minutes is to simply cover 3 points or 3 areas. The first one, I would like to reflect with you on how I am starting to see the Anthropocene in relationship to law. And this is also inspired by presentations in the series, together with some common readings that I felt lucky enough to have already done. But then I would like to enter into a discussion with you. I'm assuming that most of you are not amenable to legal practice, what is law, and so on. So I would like to propose a distinction between two ways of approaching the law in general, but especially in the context of what's Anthropocene debates. One is what can be called an instrumental, I would say actually instrumentalist approach. Another one, constitutive approach. These are ugly words. I will say more about those though. And I want to highlight the importance to consider both approaches to see the role of law in the Anthropocene. Because my suspicion, coming also from practice, is that within the practice of the law and outside also from other disciplinary perspective, the view tends to be instrumentalist, and this comes with limitations. Yeah. So by proposing, a more sometimes holistic approach, yeah, my idea is to maybe come with some reflections on what can law do, what is its relevance for future pathways for ecological justice. Yeah. So very unambitious, but I'll get started. And if I have to reflect on what is the potential connection, right, between this thing that we call Anthropocene in science, in different discipline, and as an entry point to its relevance for the law, by reading some common readings that have been already mentioned by others in this lecture series. What comes up to me is that the Anthropocene can be, among many things, a metaphor, yeah, or a heuristic. So something that an utterance, a word that can inspire ways to bring knowledge towards beyond certain boundaries. That's why I think it's capturing so much attention from different disciplines, but also a heuristic. And a heuristic is a bit different. So it doesn't bring knowledge beyond boundaries, but instead it enables to understand more about yourself within a boundary, especially as for instance, a legal scholar in academia, in law, right? And this to me has the potential to create new imaginaries. So Petra, what you were mentioning about thinking really beyond, right? For the role of humans in Earth systems, yeah, and across geological time. I will cover that a little bit more, what I mean by that. And of course, there are different conceptualizations of the Anthropocene. I think they've already been discussed. I'm really happy to enter that into those later. But when I talk about this, I talk about the Anthropocene as it started, let's say, with Crutzen, but also other configurations like the Capitolocene or the Cthulhucene or the Plantationocene, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that term correctly now. But what does then a concept that is so powerful, how does create something relevant for law? And an entry point, I think, is that the type of debate that has been instilled in science is creating forms of normativity. Yeah. So as normative properties. What do I mean by that? Well, these are diagrams or figures that Sjoerd has already showed, by the way, right? So the planetary boundaries, the donut economics, the 1.5 degree goal, and the pathways that we should try to reach in order to stay within a relatively safe climate, right? So all this knowledge, and also the rate of extinction of species that is skyrocketing. Yeah. So the Anthropocene is not just about climate; it's about other dimensions of Earth systems. What they are creating are boundaries, right? What is a boundary? It's a constraint. that we are imagining in society. They're trying to tell us a should. You should, we should, the ones that have more means should, the ones with the historical responsibility should, and the ones with less responsibility should less or shouldn't. Yeah. So I think this is the entry point for thinking about the role of law in the Anthropocene. Is an interesting one, at least. It worked for me. And so this got me thinking while preparing this lecture, okay, so what role can law have in the context of the Anthropocene and justice? So I actually can give a very quick answer now to the title of this presentation, a health check on the law in the Anthropocene. Well, it's most likely breaking bad news as well, right? It's clear that law is not equipped to deal with the complexity of the Earth system in the Anthropocene. To me, it looks rather clear, so I can gloss over on that. And that law in relationship to justice is not one way. I guess that from life experiences also, you know that law can create injustice and can create justice, right? So what is this law that I'm talking about? And here I would like to come with a provocation for those who are not dealing with law in their everyday practice or life. And it's the following one. I'm inspired by an amazing work by Katharina Pistor of research transformed in a wonderful monograph called The Code of Capital. And she, in her study, in her research, she basically made a social legal analysis of how the law itself is at the basis of the construction of the relations in society, in capital. Yeah. And she came with this stark, this quite straightforward statement that most observers treat law as a sideshow, when in fact it is the very cloth from which capital is cut. So my proposition or provocation for discussions is the following. Well, maybe also in the context of the Anthropocene, there is this type of approach, yeah, that in a certain sense and from certain domains, usually law is seen not much as a sideshow, but as a kind of relinquished role or a role that is monodimensional. And here I come with the proposition, the second proposition that I wanted to make, that there is a tendency to have an instrumentalist view of the law in the context of the Anthropocene, in the debates that I've been reading, but not everything, in every debate. And what do I mean by an instrumentalist view of the law? And here we need to go into legal theory and definition. I won't do it, but I have to come with a legal understanding of the law from this type of view, right? And so law can be definitely described as a set of systematic rules. So they work in a system, they must be coherent for the lawyers, and of principles that can determine human behavior. Isn't that the function of the law, right? It can determine, that not necessarily do, of course, not all the time, but this is usually the, I would say, and I'm here to curious to hear your view later, but this is generally a common view about the law. So it's something that humans use to conduct human behavior, yeah, by different means. And this brings a specific logic, which is instrumentalist to this type of conception. Why? Because then one of the typical instrumentalist approach to the law is that, okay, so we have a problem of in the world, and we have certain facts. There are certain rules that apply, or certain rules, or they don't exist. And therefore, we should either create new law, or use the existing rules in order to make this law applicable and applied in a context so that we can change behavior according to the law. Yeah? And a type of approach of this kind is instrumentalist and reflects a system, law as a system that is closed. So it's a type of inner discussion within lawyers on how law is created, is applied, right? It's purely a game that the lawyers and legal officials play in this closed system in order to bring forward a certain goal. And what is the consequence of that? I'm not criticizing this as something negative. It's actually can be really useful in Anthropocene, an instrumentalist approach. Well, we have the example, Petra. So this is a way of, I think, the way in which, in the face of the emergency, the crisis, has been the first response by, of course, activists, but also by lawyers, right? So we are having a problem. How do we respond to that? Well, we sue, right? We have certain rights. We have human rights. We have, in the case of Milieu Defense and Shell, we have Dutch tort law that can be interpreted in a way, right, within the legal system, in the closed system, in a way that we can reach a goal. And has the goal been reached? Well, I keep fingers crossed. But so far, I mean, this case is appealed, but it was groundbreaking. Yeah. So I'm not negative about the instrumentalist approach to the law. I'm just saying that it's partial. In what sense? Because there are certain unknowns about this mushrooming of litigations that are happening, not just in the Netherlands, but around the world, basically. Yeah. And also at the international level at the UN, is that I pose one problem now and then a second later. The first one is, well, we don't know if actually even a positive pronouncement will bring Shell to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. We just don't know. And the second is, so I have three actually, but and the second is, well, supposing that this is going to happen, what are the consequences of a decision of this kind? So this is a starting point to reach an interim goal that it's hopefully a step for something bigger, yeah, later. So it stops there, an instrumentalist view of an approach of this kind. That's why, and I keep it short, what I would like to show from some research that I've been doing in the last year, that there can be other approaches that can also be meaningful. Yeah. And what I'm talking about is a different way of seeing the law, which is often underlooked. And it's what I call the constitutive view. Well, I don't call it, sorry, it's really there in the literature, but it's the constitutive view of the law. And here you have someone who had this view. So instead of seeing the law as a coherent system of rules, law is conceived as a system of communications and utterances. We're actually using just words when we do law, if you think about it, words that have power, right? But this system of talking with law about law and using utterances that have a form of authority, it's actually not closed. It's open. It's open to other domains of social relations. So, for instance, ethics, politics, you name it. Okay, the different branches of social sciences, and well, different ways of categorizing social action. But the promise of seeing this law in another way is that it connects with these utterances also with other systems. So this is where lawyers that are starting to deal with the Anthropocene are trying to rethink law or push for this view of the law. Yeah. So with our power as humans of using words to change behavior through a specific way, the way of law, there can be also connections with the systems of the earth. Yeah. So this is can be quite abstract, right? And especially at this time of the day. So I want to give a more, not very, I don't know, but more concrete example of what I mean by constitutive role of the law, of understanding of the law. And of course, viewing the law in this way shifts the perspective. Yeah. So law is not just an instrument, but it's a way to see what it's creating. Yeah. Constitutive means creating. What is the law creating when it works in this way? Yeah. So, for instance, if I see a factory, the state permitting, right, the extraction of new gas in the North Sea here, I ask myself, how is the law structured that the state can still do this today? Yeah. So it really shifts the perspective. And so I would like to share how I've been recently working on this idea, yeah, in the context of international climate change law. So the negotiations that are happening at the UN, yeah, under the UN treaties. And Sjoerd, you had a similar diagram, but what this diagram shows is, in this case, the rising of the parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and then important legal instruments that have happened through time, yeah, or meetings, institutional meetings, right? So there is clearly something going on also with the law there, yeah. And so what I've been curious about, because I've been working in this field for a while, is to what extent international law is constitutive of the delays that are taking place in taking certain decisions at the UN. Yeah. So what is there in international law that is structural, that makes all this complex world of the UN negotiations unwieldy, so non-generative of the necessary responses that we need? Has law something to do with it? So not just not politics, yeah, I'm trying to separate domains here. Not sociology, of course there is that, but what about law itself? And so I've been investigating. Don't worry, you don't need to read this. This is just a table to show a timeline. But I've been investigating whether in a specific area of negotiation, which is about climate justice, so it's technically called loss and damage. So to what extent the most vulnerable countries must be helped, including financially via compensation, for the loss and damage that they are already suffering from inaction by the developed countries, yeah, on climate change. So this is the idea of the loss and damage negotiations at the UN. And this is something that is coming up mainstream, like in the news every year now, the COP in the last couple of years. But what has the law created? Yeah. So if states in international law have to agree on an outcome by giving their consent, this creates a specific form of politics, yeah, but also a specific form of legal outcomes. And what you see here, you just need to see that here. States have been dealing with the problem since 1991 of loss and damage, even before the adoption of the Anthropocene. And in 2023 now, the COP28 is supposed to adopt the establishment, so adopt the governing instrument of the International Fund on Loss and Damage. Yeah? So it just took more than 30 years to arrive at the establishment of a fund. Yeah. So where I'm going is that international law is creating a specific time that it's completely misaligned with the time of the Earth system and their acceleration, right? It does so by repeating certain patterns. I won't go into the details, but institutions are created, and then a new fund is created, and then a new initiative is created, and so on and so on and so on. So there is something repetitive there. And having the awareness of this as a climate negotiator, for instance, it can empower certain responses, right? So if law is the legal process is creating a certain result, maybe having awareness of this might instill strategies from disengaging from certain dynamics of the law. But instead, I can see that there is more and more engagement into this, and I'm actually worried. Right. So briefly to conclude on a couple of points, I'm not calling for dismantling the instrumental view of the law. The strategic use of the law as a tool for dealing with the Anthropocene and promoting justice is extremely useful. But what we also, I would like to engage also in a discussion on it is, okay, but what is the law constituting? What is creating there? How can we assess maybe what climate litigation is going to create in the future? Yeah. So these are, and how can we shape it better for the future? Yeah. So what I'm calling for is a reinforcing relationship between the two in order to promote forms of ecological justice. And I conclude with this final message, which to me sounds quite obvious from a legal scholar, being Wallace, that as lawyers and researchers and practitioners, I think we should revisit in entirely the law within this new normativity of the Anthropocene. And that's happening, yeah. So a sneak peek from the discipline of the law and research in law is that there is a lot of work that is quite promising and is being done. It's cited here in the list of references, but I'm really happy to continue on expanding on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And is there any specific questions for David? Otherwise, we can open the floor to the discussion with Petra also here on stage.
I do have a question.
Come here.
Yeah, I do have a question. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm not familiar with the thinking, but thank you for giving some insight. Your talk reminded me of Sarah Ahmed's work on diversity. She interviews diversity workers, equality officers in universities. And then she, to summarize very shortly her point, she says, so universities are drafting policies on equality and diversity for something that they're not doing, because that's why you're drafting policies. And then when they have written the policy, they think they have done the work. And she calls that doing the documents. And that reminds me very much of what you're saying with the COPs and the, like in a way, it's repetitive. It's like of a story that repeats itself, and you need new documents because again, you haven't done what you were not doing.
Reacting to this, no, definitely.
Is that an understanding that relates to what you?
I think it relates a lot with this study. But the thing, maybe to make a distinction though, is that it's not that. So what I see from the description of this study is that a policy is created, right? So as a lawyer, we think the legal act is made, but then it's not implemented, right? And this is actually, if I have to do a health check on the Paris Agreement on climate change, this is the problem, right? So we have the policy, but it's not being implemented yet so far. But the Kyoto Protocol has been implemented, which was the treaty before. The UNFCCC is being constantly implemented. So my critique is even when it is implemented, right?
Yeah.
So when it really changes the behavior, but what type of behavior it's creating, right? So it's certainly insufficient. We know it just by listening to science.
Yeah.
But it does
yeah.
resonate with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Anyone?
Reflections, thoughts.
Maybe start following up then, David. First, maybe, the distinction you made between normativity and constituency in the law. I recently read a lot about climate denialism, how actually climate denialism by everyone, the industry, politics, creates narratives also to let us believe that changes are not so severe. It can take some time. It's proven that the fossil fuel industry, of course, has slowed down progress against climate change measurements tremendously. So, of course, you showed the defeat of Shell against Milieudefensie, and that's only because it even hasn't been followed up in that sense. So, when are we going to see more of this? Of more? Well, I think convictions or normative measurements on climate denialism. So it becomes really punishable if you are deceiving the public or if you are mistreating society. So you're touching on an area on where I have to admit I'm not a legal expert. It's very lawyerly answer on this. But it is fundamental, right? So there can be different dimensions on especially coerced, organized practices from carbon majors, fossil fuel corporations geared towards disinformation. So the one legal lens that I could see playing a role again, it's again contributing on the question of damage, right? On causation of damage, because this type of behavior can be part of a more composite set of behavior that can prove the active role in causing. And this is where it's difficult to talk about it, right? But causing environmental damage, so climate destruction, we can call it so.
Or human health problems.
Yeah, and human health. Yeah.
But loss and damage analysis, it's the same sort of debate as you demonstrate now about responsibilities taking place. Because what I learned from that discussion is that the rich countries still don't take the responsibility. Used forecast pretty bad, actually, in COP28. Yeah, and the thing again is, what do we mean by taking the responsibility, right? Because under the treaties, under the law, there is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities among countries, right? It's there, and the treaties are rather coherent. So it's instrumental, right? System, everything is coherent, are rather coherent in trickling down this principle of common but differentiated responsibility in a set of obligations and relationships between countries. To give an example, climate finance. So developed countries should channel finance to the least developed and developing, loss and damage, right? And also the sub-principle in the Paris Agreement where it is clear, every state accepted it, that developed states have to take the lead. So it's written, that's how it's written in the Paris Agreement. But then, right, the question is, what does taking the lead specifically mean, right? How much are you going to reduce in terms of emissions, by what, by when? Yeah, and that's when, of course, the more you go into the details of implementation, you see that something is created. And what is created, maybe it's a device of procrastination. That's where I'm trying to go with my research, right? So how can you detect that plausibly? Yeah, with good arguments. It's impossible to, I think,
do an empirical research and find it with absolute certainty that that's it. But there must be a discussion that at a certain point, certain dynamics that the law is creating should be disengaged. Yeah. So this is what, yeah. What is he? Yeah.
What about Clemens has a question.
But it's very broad.
Ask your question.
Nice. So it's more was Petra, you were discussing all these interesting authors. One of them is Amitav Ghosh, who I'm currently reading, and one of the things that he was writing is found interesting is that he said that in a crisis like the COVID crisis, it seems that those societies react best or like are most resilient, which are like the most equal and most solidaristic. Maybe is this so? Could it then be said that in fact, let's say, working for climate action would just be like working for a more solid, like a really fair and solitary society? So even people who are like not explicitly working for climate justice can do so by like fighting for justice in this way. So there was like one comment, and then other issues that I was then thinking, like I'm struggling a little bit with, is that the like implication of like climate action is like typically degrowth, right? Like stop doing like like gigantic economic growth, you know, degrowth. And the problem also like laid out by Amitav Ghosh is that the geopolitical power is just like still like overlapping with like fossil power, like access to energy. And I'm wondering like how the relationship of like because it feels like this issue of the problem of power. So you need to also in some ways dominate the planet, or like how do you deal with domination by fossil powers? Like how are we addressing this? Is it just by fighting for a more just society in the Netherlands or in Europe? Is this like already doing it? So that's what I'm struggling with. Anyway, it's very broad. Throwing it at you.
I was looking at you for taking on the big powers as lawyers. Don't ask that from medicine, or maybe there's way more power, I think, in medicine and in the health field, and also corporations. So as for the justice question and the equal societies, there's a lot of evidence for how to explain that, for like more equal societies being healthier, in particular when they're wealthier. So high income countries, all people, even like the richer ones, are healthier in more equal societies. When it comes to low income countries, we cannot speak about degrowth. That's insane. That's keeping them in the basement. So they have to be able to use fossil fuels and grow and increase their GDP. But then maybe Julia can comment on that. But that's the idea, that like low income countries need to become wealthier. And for that, they may need fossil fuels to make that jump. And that would be possible if we cap luxury emissions in the richer countries, the high income countries. So that should be possible, and that's been calculated and said that I don't know. I mean, it's not my field, but that's what I ran into. So equal societies, yes, and also because you need to take climate measures, whatever that is. If you need to insulate homes and you need to solar panels and you need to be more efficient with electricity, etc. And for that, you need everyone on board. And when people are too poor or too much struggling too much with their daily lives, there's no room for them to participate in this transition. So yeah, that's clear, and it's not, and that's not going in the direction of everybody an electric vehicle. That's not the direction that we're going into. if we want to be more equal. We need to do different things and we need to rethink. And the other question, I don't know, I can't stop thinking about the corporations and the legal construction of the corporations and how we can target that. And then your talk reminded me of this. There's this video on the internet, you may like it. It's this talk by, I think his name is Emmanuel Faber from Danone. And he's a climber. He's a climber and a nature lover. And then imagine you realize that the glaciers are melting and your job is to be the CEO of a company that sells dairy in plastic. Like, and then the penny drops and he realizes that. And then he tells the audience in this big speech, he tells the audience, we killed the cycle of life. And then obviously he got sent away 6 months later, someone else was having the job. So the green CEOs, that's not a solution because they're sent away by the shareholders. So we have to have a way to take them on, right? We have to somehow be able to shut them down in the way they plunder.
Maybe closer to your own field, Petra, or the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't heard you about it yet.
Well, yeah. But what we can say about that is that there's a lot of emissions from the pharmaceutical industry, and that's the medicines, the drugs are made in low-income countries. So this is how India's emissions go up, and then we have the net zero and the decline of our emissions here because we outsourced it to other countries. So like this whole system is horrible. And then the pollution from medication into the groundwater and whatever, what have you, hormones, all of that. Yeah.
The influence of the pharmaceutical industry on our society is big, of course, also on our health society.
Yeah.
And you wonder, of course, and connecting also you with David, is also when is the legal infrastructure so far that we can put boundaries in pharmaceutical industries, which cause so much damage in many different aspects. Yeah. When is our society ready for that?
Because law comes later, right? Comes when the damage is done, usually.
Yeah. So
but it's not coming from within the system. It's not coming from within the healthcare system, because physicians and the whole healthcare system is running into that direction where it's a business model to make people sick and then heal them again. Like this is the cycle that I used to call that they steal your health and then they sell it back to you type of cycle. And I think I'm not far off, really. I haven't seen a lot of evidence for the contrary. So yeah, but this is how it works, and it's someone's wallet. Julia,
I had another question. I don't know.
There was a question here
too.
too.
But you go first if you want.
I have a question about it.
Thanks.
So I mean, when you think about cases like your defense against Shell, of course, that's one way to use existing law in countries like the Netherlands, but there are also these very large fossil fuel companies that are owned by nations, right? That are state-owned, actually.
Yeah.
So are there any instruments in the law, in international law, perhaps, to sort of target them and lawsuits like that?
International law, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
State-owned fossil fuel
Norway.
companies, we won't make names, but we know them, yeah?
Yes.
So whether there can be direct action in international law against them, it's quite tricky. Technically, this relates to what extent the actions of a state-owned enterprise can be attributed to the state. Because if one can forge an argument that this is the case, then one could use a obligation under international law where states must not cause significant damage in the territory of other states. But we're not seeing a case like this coming up of any kind. Or also, I can tell you in the discussions on climate litigations and international law, because this argument will be very feeble. It's very difficult to do this attribution of a state-owned, the acts of a state-owned enterprise to a state.
My question was also to you, but it might be a difficult one, but it's not quite. So you are obviously talking about these structures of procrastination, and I think maybe somewhat intuitively we all know that the law is quite slow generally in how it starts to think about things and tackle them. But I was wondering if we're talking about changing the law and adapting it to be quicker and more, how do we even, is there any research on that, or is there any ideas for that?
Yeah, so if I would have, the silver bullet answer,
of course,
but we are there, right? So no, thanks for the question, because this opens up a little bit more a perspective that I wanted to give, and this resonates a lot on what is happening in other disciplines, right? Because if you look at law in this way, an open system, then the potential for change comes from other disciplines. So there is a burgeoning strand of the literature in legal literature that is taking elements from other disciplines, including my work, for instance, on procrastination, right? It's psychology and philosophy mainly, that it's trying to find ways to create forms of reflexive law. So law that can respond quickly to the changing constraints of the Earth systems, right? So I can mention some, and they're very different approaches. So there is Kim from Utrecht University and Kotze. They have started a debate as to whether we should have an Earth system law, so not international law, Earth system law, where also these boundaries become part of the system, right? So how do you make them part of the system? There are some discussions on, hey, let's put them in a constitution. So you have human rights, and then you have planetary boundaries rights. I don't know how to call them, right? Of course, there would be tensions, but then can instigate forms of more reflexive decision-making, for instance, at domestic level. Another strand that really inspires me is thinkers that are inspired by cyberfeminism, for instance. So what is the relationship of the law and the critters that are not non-human, right? So far, of course, there is objectivization of that. So law is for humans and nature is an object. While there is a lot of very promising studies on how do we include them as part of the law, and so, for instance, there are techniques emerging of giving rights to nature. So a river becomes a legal subject. A forest that is storing, well, it comes with many ecosystem services. Some people would say, but it has an intrinsic value on its own and has a right on its own. There is a lot of debate on that, and there are actually some states that are acting on this. So let's see what will come. But time is definitely ticking, and we're procrastinating collectively.
Okay, it's a good finish. Let's see what will come. So with that, I'd like to conclude tonight's lecture. I want to thank you both very much for sharing your insights and your expertise. And I also want to thank all of you for coming. We'll have another lecture, the very last one, coming up in 2 weeks. We'll talk about the new economy. So also, I think lots of discussion there. So thank you very much for joining tonight. We have always more events coming up. Just check our website or our newsletter, and then you'll stay updated. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to us. Thank you very much.